Great. We're recording this session to make sure that folks who weren't able to join us during their lunch hour are able to access today's information. And then lastly, before I turn it over to our wonderful panel, I do want to issue a content trigger warning to name that today's session is going to be discussing topics around campus sexual violence. And this is a really challenging topic for many of us. So we're grateful that all of you are in this space here. We encourage folks to practice self-care as we have these challenging conversations together. And if there's anything that we can do to make this a safer space for you to be able to participate, please don't hesitate to let us know and reach out. And so with that, I'm going to pass it to our moderator. It's my honor to introduce our moderator today, David Lombardo. I will be reading your bio. David Lombardo is the host of WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, a daily radio show covering state, government, and politics. He is also the host of Connect New York, a monthly public affairs television program. David has worked in Planet Albany for more than a decade, including stints in the New York Assembly and Times Union. So passing it to you, David.
Yeah, thank you, Sam, for getting things going there. I want to now give the panelists a chance to introduce themselves, and hopefully they can share their name, title, pronouns, and their personal connection to campus sexual violence advocacy. Emily, why don't we start with you?
Thank you so much. My name is Emily Miles. I'm the executive director of the New York City Alliance Against Sexual Assault. And my connection is, as part of the New York City Alliance, we have an Enough is Enough program. We are also one of 2 Enough is Enough training and technical assistance providers in the state. But then just personally, this is an issue I have worked on since I was in college myself. Unfortunately, too many of my friends and family members experienced sexual violence while they were engaged in their higher education. And it was something that really inspired me and got me into this work. And so it's really the core of why I'm even doing this work today.
Will, same rundown from you.
Yeah, thanks, David. So hi, everyone. I am Will Rivera. I am the interim executive director for the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault, formerly known as NYSCASA. NYSCASA is the membership coalition for the state, where we help and oversee 83 rape crisis programs throughout New York State. And personally, previously, I was a rape crisis counselor and victim advocate for over 17 years. And so I have been doing ground level response for my whole career. So thank you all for coming, and appreciate your time.
Trey.
Hi, everyone. My name is Trey Shopanunos. I also go by Trey. I use she, they pronouns. I've been working in campus sexual violence support, also the student organizer from Wichita State University. And then in 2018, I moved to New York to do on-campus sexual support at Colgate University as part of Haven, their on-campus sexual assault resource center that was created through student activism and protest. And I also received my master's in applied social research, and I'm the author of the EIE white paper that is being shared today. Thank you.
And last but not least, Tandile.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tandile. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the campus intern at the New York City Alliance, and I'm a student at Barnard College. So my connection to this work is personally as a survivor, as a person in community with survivors. This work is very important to me, so I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
So we're planning a wide-ranging conversation, which is going to get into the weeds. But first, Emily, can you help us build, I guess, a foundation of knowledge by explaining both the background for New York's Enough is Enough law, kind of the environmental and political issues surrounding the passing of the law, and identify some of the highlights of the measure, maybe some of the 10,000-foot components of it?
Absolutely. So, and the Enough is Enough legislation was passed in 2015, and at the time of its passage really was a model piece of legislation across the country. Other states utilized Enough is Enough as a foundation for their efforts to combat campus sexual violence, and New York State was really a leader in this work. The legislation did a couple of things. One, it mandated uniform definitions of affirmative consent. It mandated trainings on college campuses for students, faculty, and staff. It also had a compliance monitoring component and a campus climate survey component as well. One of the other aspects of it, though, was it created a funding stream for rape crisis programs to work in partnership with their local campuses to be the experts and join in this work in partnership with those campuses. And so currently 53 rape crisis programs across New York State are Enough is Enough providers. And what that means is that they partner with their local campuses in a variety of ways. Many of them provide the on-campus trainings for students, faculty, and staff, because these rape crisis programs are the experts in this work and in the provision of these trainings and best practices around that. They also lend support to campuses who are creating their campus climate surveys, but also they are a medium for survivors to gain access to services if they have experienced violence. So if a student comes forward having experienced violence, they can contact their local Enough is Enough provider, and they will either provide those services themselves or connect them to a program that can provide short-term counseling, long-term counseling, but also help them navigate a very, very, very complex Title IX process, which kind of governs the workings of campus sexual violence response. So these Enough is Enough programs work on the prevention side through trainings and bystander awareness, but also on the intervention side once violence has occurred. I think one of the core components, though, about Enough is Enough, and I do want to stop and say, this is a really great program. It's a great piece of legislation. It is a strong piece of legislation, and empowering these partnerships between rape crisis programs and campuses is 100% the way to go. But unfortunately, when Enough is Enough was first then funded, it was funded at $4.5 million. And that honestly wasn't enough to honestly meet the need of this program at its inception in 2015. But it has remained level funded since then, which means every year with every bout of inflation, the purchasing power of that initial investment just declines. And so all of these programs that are doing this critical work are in essence facing a cut every year, which means that there is a decline in staffing. There's high level of staff turnover in these positions. And we're not seeing the return on investment that we could if there was, the real investment monetarily in this work.
Well, Will, Emily sort of got the ball rolling on this with regards to the implementation of the Enough is Enough law. But from your perspective, where the rubber meets the road, how has the phase-in of Enough is Enough gone? For example, are all the elements of the measure being implemented as far as we know?
Thanks, David. According to our report, it states that there's over 60,000 students who do not have access to an Enough is Enough provider on their campus, okay? And so this cut in funding every year that we're seeing and being unanswered by the New York State government is essentially reducing the availability of services on campus. So campuses, programs are being forced to reduce their time on campuses because of funding issues, because now they have to serve on other grants, right, and be supplemented to do that. And so what we really want, and those of us in this work know, is that prevention is the key, right? We don't want our first point of contact to be with individuals when they're faced with one of the worst parts of their lives, right? So we want to focus our time on prevention. We want to focus our time on being available for training, focus our time to have office hours, but this cannot be done because of the lack of funding and support from New York State. So if our demands can't be answered, we are going to face having to cut things even further. Okay, and those cuts are going to be felt the hardest by our students of color, our students in marginalized populations, and we cannot continue to keep on letting that happen.
Well, Tandile, can you kind of articulate what it actually means for, say, as Will said, 60,000 students not to have access? What are the ramifications of that to real people?
Right. So basically, because we have an understanding of what EIE does, not having access to those services really means that students are not receiving training, especially are not receiving culturally specific or congruent training that is addressing the specific needs of many vulnerable populations that Will was talking about. Students of color, LGBTQ plus students, disabled students, all of these groups are more vulnerable. We have many studies and statistics that show that these populations are more vulnerable to sexual violence and all types of violence, both on and off campus. And so not having access to EIE services really hits us hard, hits those students' populations hard, to not have available EIE providers to both educate and respond to instances of sexual violence on campus.
Well, Tandile, just to hammer that home, what are the short-term and long-term consequences, though, for these individuals from not accessing the appropriate services in the aftermath of a sexual assault?
Yeah. So short term, it really can make, from a survivor's perspective, that can make a survivor feel very isolated and alone, to not have those resources readily available or not be able to know where to find those resources. And then a long-term effect is, if those needs are going unmet, unfortunately, the mental health consequences of being a survivor and going through an instance of violence can be very serious. The physical health, educational performance obviously can be affected if you're not well, because you are healing or trying to heal from sexual violence. So yeah, those are some of the effects that I see in my community that I've experienced myself, like not having access to certain resources, whether that's mental health, whether that's education, whether that's peer support, all of those kinds of things come into play.
So Trey, one of the things that stood out to me from the Enough is Enough report that you worked on is the lack of oversight from the state on compliance with the Enough is Enough law. Can you talk a little bit about what we know in terms of the state actually keeping tabs on this program and what we don't know as a result of the state not really keeping tabs on this program?
Yeah, thank you. So as a data nerd, it was really a great honor to kind of to create this paper and kind of dive into where we're overlooking a lot of spaces. So one of the big things about what we know is that our current data collection or our current information is not up to date. After, there was a large momentum after Enough is Enough was passed and introduced, in 2016 and in 2017, there was, a statewide compliance review to do a temperature check. Where are campuses? Where are they compliant? Where are they approaching compliance? Where are they nowhere near compliance? And that was information in 2017. It was a very bird's eye view information. It just was very snapshot, very black and white. And something that gets kind of lost to that is that every campus, while they all have the same mandates, they do not all have the same resources. They don't all have the same staffing structures, and they don't all have the same communities that they're trying to prevent violence within. And so what's missing from that information not only is the richness of understanding the problem, but then with that, when you don't have that richness, then you can't also have a culturally responsive solution as well. And so something that additional data collection will do also is to give us more measurable, clear, and a shared understanding of the true impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have anecdotally all talked about it in great depth. We've shared a lot of qualitative, rich conversational information, but when it comes to actually doing our best to pinpoint how has COVID already added further disruption into a system that already had a lot of cracks. We don't even have, shareable data around that. And we need that if we're going to actually be able to create solutions that are sustainable and in response to the communities that we're trying to serve. I like to say, think global, act local. We can't think statewide and act locally if we don't know exactly what we're acting for.
I have a follow-up question on this for Emily, but first I just want to remind all of the people watching the panel to make sure they're doing the poll everywhere question if they haven't already done it, and reminder that you can enter questions into the chat that we'll try to incorporate into the discussion. But Emily, using my moderator's prerogative, if the state was to continue to do some sort of meaningful oversight of this program, who would it fall to? Is this something that is under the bailiwick of the state education department? Is it the Division of Criminal Justice Services? Is it a third player that I haven't thought of that should be monitoring this more closely?
So per the Enough is Enough legislation, the State Department of Education has authority to conduct compliance reviews of the Enough is Enough program. And if you go to their website, you will see a number of reports listed by year that they, call the Enough is Enough compliance reports. But if you actually pull them up, and the data nerds among us, I encourage you to do so, what you will actually see is a list of numbers that are reported out that have very little bearing on whether a campus is actually adhering to the spirit of Enough is Enough legislation. So those data tables will tell you the number of incidents that occurred on a campus, but it doesn't tell you, was that an incidence of sexual violence? Was it an incidence of IPV? Was it an incident of stalking? Did it happen in person? Did it happen virtually through technology abuse, which we are seeing huge spikes in as a result of the COVID pandemic? It will tell you the absolute number of trainings that happened, but it won't tell you, were those freshmen that were trained? Were those college athletes? Were those transfer students? 3 categories of students that are mandated to be trained as part of the Enough is Enough legislation. So the current data that we are collecting is just not aligned with some of the key tenets of the Enough is Enough legislation. Are there model policies? Are campus climate surveys being conducted in a way that students can participate? Is there access to these services? Are these campuses working with Enough is Enough programs? And so the compliance review that Trey spoke of that was conducted in 2017 was actually conducted by the Office of Campus Safety, which technically no longer exists because it was pulled into the Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence, OPDV. What we would like to see, honestly, are these agencies working together on this compliance review, because it really needs the perspective of multiple leaders across the state government to ensure that we are looking at various points of this compliance.
So moving forward, oversight is not the only area of this program that is ripe for reform, because as Emily mentioned earlier, the initial funding and the funding every year since has not been adequate, and the group is looking for additional funding to be invested into the Enough is Enough law. Will, what is the top line dollar amount that you're looking for in the 2024 budget process? And can you highlight maybe 1 or 2 of the areas that you're looking to get invested in?
Yeah, thanks, David. So do I have to put a number? Because then I don't want to be held to that, because I want to say, show me the money, right?
We could say at least $9.6 million.
So we're asking, we're asking for at least 9 million. Of course, all the advocates of programs on here will tell me, ask for more, Will, right? And so, please, funders, state government, send more if you can. But we are asking for a minimum of 9 million, so that programs across the state can ensure that they're having full access to advocates at all times, so that they can become the experts, so that they're available, so they can provide the important prevention training, and also focusing on creating and drafting poultry specific training as well. And so we're also asking to fund a coordinated response team demonstration project, where we would like to highlight and pilot 5 sites where there's essentially, we're creating a coordinated response team, which is a multidisciplinary team of individuals such as advocates, law enforcement, health providers, Title IX, so that when these incidences occur, that there's a response team that can come together and provide this essential service to this one individual, right? Just imagine reporting your story once to all of these individuals, so that you don't have to continue to go down and relive the traumatic events that happened to you, right? So we're asking to provide funding for 5 sites, so that we can provide the data that shows how successful this is. And so we cannot do that or continue this the way we are operating without the support and funding from New York State government.
So Tandile, the CCRT model that Will just outlined, how is that different than what is maybe commonly practiced at campuses around New York in the aftermath of a sexual assault? Are there schools that you are aware of that are doing this, or would this represent a major change in the status quo?
To my knowledge, the widespread implementation of CCRTs would represent a major shift in how sexual violence is handled on college campuses. So the way that it is set up, at least on my campus and most of the campuses that people in my community attend, is if you want to access multiple resources, which is basically what a CCRT does, right? It provides you multiple avenues of support through one kind of entity. If you want to access multiple resources now, you usually have to go to each of those individually. If you need medical assistance, you need to go and do that separately. And then if you need mental health assistance, you need to go and do that separately. If you want to talk to law enforcement and report, that's a whole separate process. And that can be, as Will mentioned, having to report your story multiple times to different people and relive it every time can be even more traumatic to a survivor, someone who's just gone through an incident of sexual violence. And so there's that piece of being able to access multiple resources and multiple avenues of support. But then the next part that I also want to mention with the CCRT model is the student involvement piece. And when I say that, I don't just mean the involvement of the survivor, because of course it's important to center the voice of the survivor when decisions are being made in this model, but also compensated student involvement when it comes to students on campus already who are very passionate about this work and are ready to do prevention work and create a culture of campus safety on their campuses. So the CCRT model really integrates these student voices when it comes to how best to support students, how policy should be made to handle sexual violence on campus. And it really activates the unique perspectives and insights that students have into their own campus lives, because students have the most insight and have the most knowledge about their campuses, their cultures, the needs of the students, the needs of their communities. And right now, they're an underutilized resource.
Yeah, is this something where, Tandile, you anticipate that students want to be more engaged if given the opportunity, or are we just crossing our fingers and hoping that this is something, a space where kids, Jesus Christ, I'm old, where young people want to operate and be in?
Yeah, so this is very much an issue that many students are already passionate about and are ready to get involved. I hope that we're not just crossing our fingers and hoping that people want to get involved. Based on my experience, that is not my experience. I have many members of my community, my campus community, other people I know who are my age, who are very interested in doing this kind of work. Because many of us, we know survivors. We are survivors, or we know survivors on campus. We're very interested in making a difference in this work and creating more safety for students. But like I said, that's a resource that's been underutilized so far by campuses. So yeah, people are ready. People are ready and willing.
Trey, when we think about the investment that the state should be making into Enough is Enough, is this something that can be done as a one-time investment, set it and forget it, or do advocates in the space need to be asking for continuous investments in this program? And if that's the case, what do you see as some of the recurring costs that need to be funded every single year?
Yeah, well, I think something about what we currently have is that our current funding stream gives the energy of that one-time investment, because that dollar amount was set so long ago. What you can cover in those pieces are so limited. A lot of the evidence-based curricula that people can't even currently afford anymore don't even consider, Black and brown students, disabled students, graduate students, commuter students as evidence in the first place. So quite a lot of things, like that's the model that we currently have, is that it's kind of a one size fits all. One time I threw $4 million and we're letting it be. And so what we're asking for with, I think, this data collection is, if we're going to actually talk about preventing violence in a lifelong, sustainable way, and also not just as a student, as a campus, but as a community, because campuses are not in isolation. They exist in community with other folks. And that's why that CCRT model is also so important, because that CCRT model brings in other community members, hospitals, SANE nurses, law enforcement, parents. It brings in other people who can see this as, again, as a community health prevention resource. And so what that looks like is there's multiple levels of funding that needs to go towards it. For staffing, one, our EIE providers are some of the most underpaid, under-resourced advocates doing some of the hardest work possible with little access to professional development funds, with little access to career opportunities beyond the advocate level if they don't receive an MSW. And then if they receive an MSW, there's still a glass ceiling. So there's one whole level of having to provide care for the people who are doing that work. The second level is having culturally responsive prevention programming that advocates know that their campuses are asking for, and divesting from that idea of let's keep having and divesting from the bystander intervention model as our only way of preventing, even though like prevention is not even in that word, but giving advocates opportunities and spaces to say, you know what, on my campus, we're having a high rate of stalking. And actually, I know how to talk about this. I've trained, I have a degree, I can do this workshop, but I need additional resources and time and support, or I need a budget to even create that workshop. So we don't have those resources currently. And then again, as Tandile mentioned, when it comes to student involvement, as a person, I interviewed quite a lot of students in the paper. So there was a high representation of student voice that is captured there. And these student volunteer programs that sometimes the state isn't always one, it benefits very high from, but then always providing resources to have. Students are using their opportunities with EIE providers as a real life way to test out their major. I spoke to students who are med students. I spoke to students who are in human services, and doing this work for them, it's real life, and it's immediate. And so part of that is also then having opportunities and resources where student leaders are saying, hey, I actually do want to do work around this, but I don't have any way of creating a program with an EIE provider. So really when it comes to funding is that we're not having any funding towards creativity in a public health crisis. We keep being pigeonholed into responses, and we're pigeonholed into what we can do. And that is just really holding us back from actually having sustainable violence prevention. And so this is why we need to focus on that data collection and not just those incident reports. We need to understand what's getting there. And if we're really trying to equip the next generation of leaders and politicians and future makers, then we're going to help them see that violence prevention, just like DEI, is not separate. It is embedded in every aspect of their career and every aspect of what they do.
So Emily, I want to talk about what might need to go along with a funding increase in the future if it's secured. But first, this is another reminder to people watching the panel that there is a second poll everywhere question. What are your hopes for campus sexual violence prevention and response in 2025? Emily, when we talk about funding, does this need to come with statutory language as well? Do we need to update the Enough is Enough law, which you mentioned at the time of its implementation was this groundbreaking law, but we're in 2023, 2024 is right around the corner. So does the law itself need to be updated? And then do there need to be statutory language introduced along with this funding that you will inevitably get in next year's budget?
So the answer is we think so, but we need more data. And that's where this compliance piece is really important, because when we were, conducting our research last year and over the summer, we had a lot of ideas, but we didn't have the data to support some of the changes that we think that would benefit the Enough is Enough program. So things like really understanding how many campuses are out of compliance. We have a lot of qualitative information about that, but we need more information about kind of what this looks like on each of these campuses, especially post-COVID, in order to really refine those recommendations. And so we consider this a step one in our process of strengthening the Enough is Enough legislation. One more thing I wanted to add about the funding piece, if I may.
I'll allow it.
Thank you. And Trey made absolutely, and Tandile made absolutely amazing points. One other piece I wanted to kind of highlight when we are talking about investment in enough is enough in these programs, we are also, talking about investment in these staff. Trey mentioned that enough is enough coordinators are incredibly low paid, but some of the analysis that we started to do was looking at something called the self-sufficiency standard, which is a measure that looks at the true cost of living in communities across New York State, so by county, to look at what does it actually cost to live in these communities. And you can then compare it to certain salaries to determine whether folks are being paid at an equitable wage that actually allows them to live in their communities. And when we were looking at salaries of enough is enough coordinators, one, in the New York City region, we had a difficult time finding enough is enough coordinator salaries that were at a self-sufficiency level for an individual living in the city. So that alone is a problem, right? Because that leads to high levels of turnover. People are always seeking a new opportunity because they don't earn enough to just make basic ends meet. But, everyone expects that the city is expensive to live in. So that talking point doesn't always, get us very far. So we started looking upstate at programs and some of the salaries that were offered there. And we had a hard time finding even one coordinator salary that was at the level that would sustain an individual and a child. And so what does that mean? That means we have fundamentally built into our system a level of turnover that disincentivizes these coordinators from making a career out of this work. And that is how you gain expertise. That is how you really get the depth of these interventions, is when you have a coordinator who is working overtime in building these CCRTs and building these campus relationships. Every time we have turnover, that starts again from zero. And that means the progress that has been made starts again from zero. So investing in these coordinators and investing in these salaries is investing in the longevity of these programs. And I think that sometimes gets lost. It's also very much an equity issue. When you look at the makeup of those working in this sector, you are largely talking about a more female-dominated workforce. You're talking about people of color doing this work, earning substandard wages.
I want to
Can
pivot.
I add
Yeah,
a
go for it,
piece
Trey.
real quick? I just
Yeah.
wanted to also add on top of that what Emily's talking about, because this is also the yes and approach of the CCRT, is that then when you also have, when you finally have those well-paid coordinators, the CCRT though becomes that community hub for where that information of institutional record keeping of what has happened on campus. The CCRT becomes that space where people can deposit information and keep that record of what's happening. And so that's where it all fits in, where it's like it's not just having a paid coordinator and it's not just having a CCRT. You have to have both.
So we've talked about this holistic, comprehensive, highly trained, nuanced response to sexual assaults, which has largely not been the case in the past and continues to not be the case in certain settings, with law enforcement primarily being the main institution responsible for responding to sexual assaults in certain cases. And I'm curious, Will, from your perspective, what do you see as the role of law enforcement in the future with responding to sexual violence on campuses? Specifically, can officers be trained to be part of this conversation? Should they be folded in? Should there be an aversion to law enforcement, since in particular marginalized communities often don't feel safe engaging with police officers? How should we think about police? And are there examples of police working well in this space that you think of?
Yeah, David. So I can unpack that, but first, before we do that, I want to step back. So in this work, we continue to put uh, gender violence response and law enforcement and the criminal justice response together. Okay, we cannot continue to do that, right? So gender-based violence response needs to be focusing on prevention. Okay, and so that we want to focus on prevention, because we don't want the first time someone accessing our resources would be, through the law enforcement of relationships, right? So we want them engaged with programs on the ground. We want them to see us at outreach events. We want them to see us tabling, right? So like that's what we need to be focusing in on beyond the law enforcement response. And we all know here on the field is that very small majority are the ones who are reporting, right? So maybe 5%, out of the 100 cases are being reported by individuals, right? So what are we doing for that 95% that isn't responding to when these incidents occur, right? So like we really have to unpack that. As far as the law enforcement relationship is regarding the CCRTs, is yes, they are a component of that, but it's a collaborative approach. It's how programs and law enforcement and everyone on the team can work together in making sure that culturally responsive and trauma-informed services are provided to that individual. And I do have to give a big shout out to the City of Oneonta Police Department, where I work closely with Sergeant Detective Joe Tiemann, who and his team were committed to this response as a CCRT unit with no funding, right? They said it is important for us to listen to survivors and provide a trauma-informed response. And so with no funding, we made sure that that was happening on the ground within the City of Oneonta Police Department. And so it is happening. They are committed, but we also need to make sure that that victims and survivors' access to information of our services isn't always through the law enforcement lens.
So we've got about 10 minutes left because we are going to get everybody out on time at 1:30. And as we begin to wrap things up, Tandile, what message would you hope that the people who are watching this, who are in government, whether they are in the Hochul administration or whether they're working for state lawmakers like the great Jessica Gonzalez Rojas in the Assembly? Hi, Brian. Tandile, what would you want them to take away from this? Is it just about back up the dump truck with money and let us spend it? What would you want them to know about this?
I think that I would just want to emphasize that there are very real lives behind this legislation. There's very real lives behind this funding. And that, I don't know, I think a takeaway that I always think about is just regarding EIE is that we don't have to accept campus sexual violence as just a reality. Yes, it's the reality right now, but we don't have to accept that. There are very real things, like we've been talking about this entire panel. There are very real things that we can do to reduce the impact of campus sexual violence and to stop people from becoming survivors in the first place. So I think I would just want lawmakers to come away with that point and really understand that there is a difference that each and every one of you can make. Yeah, and we hope you do make it, please.
Well, Tandile, in the course of your advocacy, have you become a jaded cynic about the prospects of improvement in this arena, or are you still optimistic about positive change?
That's a good question. I think I have had my moments of being a jaded cynic, but in doing this work, I think I remain optimistic because of people like my fellow panelists who are doing this work diligently every single day to make sure that we can reduce campus sexual violence. I'm also really inspired by my fellow students who do this work on my campus and beyond. I think that I'm optimistic because I know how many people are so committed to supporting survivors and supporting students. So I'm inspired by that, and I'm optimistic because of that. And I hope that the state will support us because we have the passion, we have the motivation, we have all the will in the world to make a difference on this issue. So we hope that the state supports us in that.
Trey, we've been talking about these issues really from a human perspective and the emotional and physical and psychological toll that these issues can have on people, and why it's important to address them. But when we're talking about dollars and cents, and the coalition is looking to double the amount of funding in Enough is Enough, what is the fiscal case for making this type of investment? Is this something where we can point to savings down the road as the result of this type of investment, whether it is as a result of more productive students or being able to prevent other expenditures down the line? Is there a dollars and cents argument to be made to state lawmakers and penny pinchers in the budget office?
I think there is. I think it's hard because it's such a, I feel like this field, unfortunately and sadly, ironically, gets that dehumanization aspect tied to it, because it's like, I think it's sad that we have to kind of quantify it in that way when we're talking about young people coming, our future young people who will be taking the reins. And that we're saying like, I think it's just, it's hard to have to kind of try to put it in that way. I think, when you think about the impact of violence, of course, you think about the amount of not just staff time, the salaries that go into these response pieces. I think for me, when I think about where my brain is at wrapping around the dollars and cents, is that for the level of boasting that the state has done around EIE, the funding level is shameful. And it is borderline a little embarrassing, I think, to say just very candidly, because of, again, what we are funding is not prevention, we're funding band-aid responses. And I think that to create these pieces around what does that look like on money saved, I think it's more, it's hard to quantify like how much a human life is worth, and how much someone's dignity is worth, and how much someone's ability to be the person who changes things in this state. Like it's such a hard thing to wrap our head around, and we've lost the plot so deeply when it comes to survivorhood being seen as and treated in these ways. And so I hope that there's a challenge through our state legislature to pull out of, or to divest from that ideology of what we can send, when it's like, honestly, we're choosing that even that only some lives matter, because even this conversation around campus violence prevention is in a silo, because on the shadow side of that, we have a whole group of young people who are not in college. So then we have a whole nother aspect where it's like, honestly, our campus sexual violence work can be a entry point into understanding how do we prevent violence for anyone who is 25 and under that's not tied to a social system and a social support network. So I don't know if that answers the question in that way, but just being very candid around it, it's one of the pieces that I hope that we can resist the dehumanization that comes with that, and that we can change how we are holistically responding to violence, and not all of us today, if we can generate that.
Emily, moving forward in the aftermath of this, what is the call to action that you would have for people who are watching this, whether they might be from a local program around the state and they're looking to get involved and to help push this cause? What would your advice be to them to help ensure that they can mobilize here in Albany in a meaningful way?
Absolutely. So you'll see in the chat a couple of links that have been posted around joining our campaign and giving us your information for updates. We have actions planned. We're going to be raising our voices through letters, op-eds, actions in Albany, and we definitely want you to join us in that. We'll only get the attention of those who are decision makers if they see us and they hear us. And so please, even if it's just for you to get updates on our work, please give us your information so we can send those to you. Everyone hears the statistics. 1 in 4 women, 1 in 9 men will have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. And that is even just considering kind of that binary, but 1 in 4 women, 1 in 9 men. But many people don't actually listen to the other part of that statistic. And Trey referenced it a second ago, that of those who experience violence, over 80% of them experience it before the age of 25. So when we hear the rhetoric and the talking points about addressing safety, about ensuring access to services, this is the population we're talking about. And we have to have a coordinated response on our campuses. And to Trey's point, it has to go beyond our campuses too. But let's take the lessons that we're learning here and expand them beyond.
And just another lightning fast question for you, Emily. There's the issue of victim services funding in New York, and right now there's the likelihood of federal dollars not being there in the upcoming budget that we've anticipated in the past. How, if at all, could that impact the issues that we're talking about today, or should we think those as a separate siloed issue?
Oh, it's the same. Oh, David, we need another webinar for that one. So yes, and I'm not going to go into the depth of some of the VOCA funding cliff that we are seeing, but in short, we are looking at a huge reduction coming from the federal government in funding for victim services programs. Other states are taking action to fill that gap. We understand it is frustrating to have to do the job of the federal government, but they are not doing it right now. And in their stead, our state needs to step up and ensure that these services have continuation. And we're looking to the governor, we're looking to the legislature to do that, to ensure a continuation of funds. If you want more information about that, go to our website, go to NYSCASA's website, and you'll get action alerts about those pieces.
Will, you got about 45 seconds before we let everyone go free. Any final words that you have for the people who've stuck it out until 1:30?
Yeah, I'll take it home, David. So listen, we can't continue to put the value of lives of New Yorkers within a grant award, okay? Let's be honest. Victim services is not a priority in this current administration, okay? This is a safety issue within our communities that continues to be unheard by state government. Each year, we continue to ask for support, and again, it goes unanswered every year. To our advocates across New York, we hear you. We know that your requests for support continue to be unanswered by New York State government. And I ask today our colleagues, our advocates, and our friends for your support. We need you to bring the energy and come together to make sure that finally New York State is heard and we get the support and services that we need.
Well, I think that's good enough place to end it as any. You guys are watching from your office, home, wherever. Please, clap for Tandile, Trey, Emily, and Will. Thank you so much for making the time, guys. And again, all of those information that you're going to want to follow up is in the chat. Hit up their websites and make sure when you're done doing all that, you subscribe to the Capitol Press Room, wherever you download your favorite podcasts. Emily and Sam, we good to go? Thumbs up. Sam, I assume you're a thumbs up as well.
We're good. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.